Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Wayne Huggins. My last name is spelled Huggins. I'm the Executive Director of the Virginia State Police Association. I'm joined today by our President and Senior Special Agent Roy Kyle, who's in the back, and another of our board members, Howard Cook. And I'm also joined by Herndon Police Chief Maggie DeBoard and Roanoke County Chief Howard Hall, who are representing the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police. Chief Hall is the president, and Chief DeBoard is the first vice president. Also, Shenandoah County Sheriff Tim Carter, who's president of the Virginia Sheriff's Association, and Mr. John Ombarger, who's president of the Virginia State Lodge of the Fraternal Order of Police. Now, before we proceed, I would kindly ask everyone to observe a moment of silence, as tomorrow is the 19th anniversary of the worst attack that's ever occurred on American soil, where we lost, as you all know, thousands of Americans and hundreds of first responders. So please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. I began my career in public safety on June the 1st, 1970, over 50 years ago. I've had the honor of serving as the Sheriff of Fairfax County and Superintendent of the Virginia State Police. I mention this to emphasize that during my career in law enforcement, I have never witnessed lower morale than there is today throughout Virginia's law enforcement community. Each day, law enforcement in Virginia has thousands upon thousands of contacts with our citizens. The Virginia State Police alone averages about 1 million contacts per year. These contacts range from helping disabled motorists, investigating crashes, issuing traffic citations, and conducting criminal investigations. Well over 99% of the time, these interactions are professional and occur without incident. However, to listen to the uninformed rhetoric we hear today, one would think that we are completely out of control and unprofessional and do not care about the safety and security of those we are sworn to serve and protect. Nothing could be further from the truth. We are well trained, professional, and exercise our authority with dignity and respect for every citizen of Virginia. This is not to say that we are perfect. Indeed, we are not. Like all professions, we have our occasional bad apple. But let me be clear, we do not want bad cops carrying a badge. We want them gone from our profession, period. To that end, we support an enhanced decertification process and standards of conduct that allows us to not only rid our agencies of these bad cops, but also prevents them from jumping from agency to agency. We support the use of body cameras, for we know what the recordings will reveal, that over 99% of the time it will show what we have to put up with and what we have to endure as police officers. We support enhanced training opportunities for subjects like de-escalation techniques and crisis intervention. We support requiring either state or national accreditation for all agencies. And we support legislation that adds COVID-19 to the list of diseases that's presumed to have been incurred on duty. Each of our agencies has police officers who have tested positive and many who are experiencing symptoms. However, these enhancements all require resources. The Virginia Senate has reached out to us and has listened to our thoughts and our suggestions, and has in fact included many of our ideas in the legislation that has been before them. On the other hand, the House of Delegates has largely ignored our thoughts and considerations, and they've passed several pieces of legislation that in reality will only hurt and indeed impede law enforcement, and in the end, not only will law enforcement suffer through high attrition and the inability to recruit high-quality men and women, but ultimately it is our citizens who are going to suffer. They can expect to see crime rates increase in all types of crimes. They will see an increase in highway fatalities, injuries, and property damage. And I'm going to turn it over in just a moment to speak about specific pieces of legislation to which I'm referring. But I would like to wrap up my comments and speak just briefly about qualified immunity. If any of you have followed the debate, particularly in the House, one of the things you have repeatedly heard is that if qualified immunity were to be eliminated, it would not result in an influx of lawsuits. Wouldn't happen. What I'm holding before me is the fiscal impact statement prepared by the Department of Planning and Budget. And I'd like to read two sentences to you. This legislation, and this is again, the Department of Planning and Budget, this legislation could substantially impact the resources of the Office of Attorney General, as well as law enforcement officers, supervisors, and agencies. The number and complexities of lawsuits filed against state law enforcement agencies could substantially increase, with a corresponding increase in intensive discovery, pretrial and trial work, mediations, and settlements. Finally, the OAG, the Office of Attorney General, might need a specialized civil trial unit devoted to state law enforcement agencies' civil cases, estimated to include. Now, this is a bill that will not increase lawsuits, but the OAG has said he may well need 6 attorneys, 4 paralegal, and 2 legal secretaries, as well as servers and software support designed to manage the substantial data involved. At this time, I would like to recognize Chief Maggie DeBoard from the town of Herndon to offer a few remarks. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Chief Maggie DeBoard. I represent the town of Herndon, and I am here today to represent the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police. I want to share something with you before I get into the specifics of reform that the Colonel just talked about, which is why we're here today. Just last week, I was asked to do a very short video for the National Law Enforcement Officer Memorial, reflecting on my memories of 9/11 and our heroes, all of our heroes who sacrificed their lives that day to save others. And when I was shooting that video, I got to thinking about how much support our profession received from our communities after those tragic events. Unwavering support on every level for the incredible work that our law enforcement officers do every day across this Commonwealth, whether they're involved in that rescue or not. In fact, I don't think community support has ever been higher for our law enforcement profession as it was 19 years ago. So I started to ask myself, 19 years later, what's changed? How did we suddenly, and I mean suddenly, become the target of extreme hate and distrust and violence in our profession? I can tell you we are still the same people that we were 19 years ago. If anything, we have continued to evolve and we are better as a profession than we were. What's changed is that many in power in politics and the media and various groups throughout our community, they have pitted our communities against us due to the misconduct of a very, very small number of bad cops. And they are spreading false information and rhetoric about our profession. And it's working. And this has led us to where we are today, to address what is being advertised to the public as police reform. But in our opinions, there is far more harm proposed than there is good. And don't get me wrong, we were both very supportive and very appreciative to get legislation proposed that will help us to ensure that we are bringing the right law enforcement officers in the door to serve our communities, and we are sending the wrong people out the door, because ultimately that's our goal every day. But we all know that meaningful reform takes time. It can't happen fast, and it takes thoughtful input from those who do the job, as well as those most affected by the outcome, and that's our community. What has been missing from this process, and it was spoke to by our last speaker, what has been missing from reform policing across the state is input from those of us to do the job. And quite frankly, we should have been looked at from the beginning as part of the solution instead of the problem. We were not invited to the table when legislation was first drafted, yet the Virginia Chiefs of Police were the first at the table to propose solutions in early June in a meeting with our governor, and we wanted him to know that we wanted to do this the right way. And we were part of that answer, as were many of our other groups here today. Instead, what we ended up doing as a profession over the last couple months is scramble to get a look at what was being proposed, and then we begged to get committee hearings, time in those hearings to provide testimonies to the negative effect many of these proposed bills would have both on our safety and certainly those of our communities. I will say, however, that we have had the opportunity to work closely with a few well-intended senators and delegates on both sides of the political spectrum to amend some of the bills and make them better. There are better bills being proposed today because we got involved. And to help them in addressing the problems identified. And those bills are in fact better because of our input, because they listened. And they wanted to get it right as well. And for that we are greatly appreciative, and we hope to continue those relationships. But most didn't listen, and most are refusing to hear us now, which is what brings us here today. Because politics speak louder than reason. You cannot develop meaningful and effective police reform without those of us at the table who have spent decades serving our communities with integrity and dedication and expect to get it right. It can't happen. We know how to get rid of bad cops. We know what additional training and resources that we need to serve our communities, and we know how to protect them. But we need help in doing that because we continue to be the only ones to call when any problem exists and government is not there to help. In the interest of time, I'm going to briefly highlight a few bills being proposed that cause us significant concern and will endanger the lives of our community and our officers if they are passed as they are written. The greatest threat to our profession is the proposed elimination of qualified immunity. There is a myth being perpetuated that qualified immunity protects bad cops. It does not, and it has not protected any of the bad cops that I have been a part of firing or separating over my 34 years in the job. It has never protected bad cops who engage in criminal behavior or significant misconduct. The current statute regarding qualified immunity protects not only law enforcement officers, but magistrates, judges, prosecutors, mental health workers, and others. Yet, the proposals, the very bills they want to eliminate, just eliminate our qualified immunity and no one else. In fact, a strong argument can be made that our profession actually needs it the most. We are the only ones covered in this statute who have to make quick, split-second decisions under stress, sometimes in the face of extreme violence, and are expected to not make a mistake. And by the way, we are constantly filmed while we're doing it. We don't have the luxury of time in many incidents to get it perfectly right, and our officers need the protection that qualified immunity provides us from frivolous lawsuits so we continue to serve without fear to act or unreasonable lawsuits hanging over our heads. The passage of this bill alone will have a crippling effect on our profession throughout the state, causing good cops to leave at the very time that we need to retain them the most. This will have a significant negative impact on the safety of our communities. Additionally, there's legislation that will change an assault on a police officer, a law enforcement officer, to a misdemeanor unless they are injured. This does nothing but encourage additional attacks on our officers serving and sheriffs serving on the front lines every day, and it devalues the critical role they are playing in keeping our communities safe. I have to ask this question. If it was important enough to be a felony to attack a law enforcement officer in the past, what suddenly justifies that now being a misdemeanor? We don't have an answer to that from those trying to pass this bill. We have to hold our law enforcement officers in high regard while keeping them accountable for their actions. There have been specific amendments to this statute that are being proposed that are reasonable. And we approve those, and we feel eliminate some of the past concerns that have been raised because we don't want to see people unduly charged. But this piece of legislation sends the wrong message to our citizens at the wrong time. A message that it's okay to fight the police. There is legislation to completely end no-knock search warrants, despite the fact that they are actually quite rare. I know this, I spent many years in that world. There is also proposed legislation to only serve search warrants in the daytime, despite the fact that many criminal enterprises operate solely at night. Both of these measures, especially when combined, will not only lead to more use of force encounters between law enforcement and our community, it will get more people killed. When you don't have the ability to make an approach under the cover of darkness, and in all cases, you have to first knock and announce your presence, you give violent and desperate criminals time to arm and defend themselves before you come in. These two proposals, if passed together, are reckless and will increase police shootings throughout the Commonwealth. We have proposed more reasonable amendments to increase safety during these dangerous operations, including suggesting restrictions that might limit how they are being used, but they are largely being ignored. Lastly, I have to fall back to my point earlier about police reform and the need to have us at the table for it, again, to be meaningful and to be effective. Yet there is an additional proposal to cut our representation on statewide committees that are being mandated to develop more effective training for our academies and our incumbent officers. There's no fixed number of members on these committees, yet as they added numerous additional community members for their input, They reduced our police and sheriff representatives to 1 each. 1. Yet these are supposed to be the standards for all of our law enforcement professionals across the state. 1 representative from police and sheriffs. But again, they don't want us at the table. They want more people at the table that have absolutely no experience in our jobs, nor complete understanding of the complexities involved. While we value additional outside input, it cannot largely be the decider of our tactics, our standards, and training if meaningful reform is to occur. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Tim Carter, C-A-R-T-E-R. I'm the Sheriff of Shenandoah County, and currently I'm the President of the Virginia Sheriff's Association. I want to first thank our host today, Chesterfield County FOP and State FOP. Thank you all for allowing us to use this venue this morning, and thank you all for allowing me for a moment to speak. The Virginia Sheriff's Association represents over 8,500 deputy sheriffs from all areas of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Sheriffs are elected to provide public safety services and directly represent communities throughout the Commonwealth. Sheriffs fully embrace the expectation to evaluate continually their offices and all of the services thereof. Similarly, sheriffs understand the community standards of their respective counties and cities. The issue of law enforcement reform is no different. The Virginia Sheriff's Association has worked and continues to work with both houses of our state legislature. Many of the bills being discussed presently have far-reaching impacts. Some we are supportive of, while some we believe need more study and review. I personally want to extend my appreciation on behalf of all sheriffs in the Commonwealth of Virginia for the leadership of both bodies of our legislature and both primary parties, as well as our Associate's Executive Director for the work that they've all achieved and continue to do regarding these important issues. Virginia Sheriff's Association is on the front line providing public safety services and law enforcement in local jails, court services. As such, deputy sheriffs are placed in harm's way each day, resulting in daily interaction with citizens of the Commonwealth. While thousands of experiences are positive, there are some in confrontations that may lead to arrest, detention, and direct contact in a moment's notice. The Virginia Sheriff's Association is working with both houses and both parties to address many of these proposals of police reform. Key principles among those proposals that support or have support of the Virginia Sheriff's Association are adding the COVID presumption for law enforcement officers, decertification of bad law enforcement officers who are not performing their job to ensure public safety, establishing a statewide database for decertified law enforcement officers to aid and avoid rehiring those officers that should not be in this profession, creating a duty to intervene in protocol by fellow officers when present and necessary, and enhancing the current law enforcement accreditation program known as the Virginia Law Enforcement Professional Standards Commission. Quite simply, the Virginia Sheriff's Association is opposed to removing felony punishment for assaulting a law enforcement officer. We're opposed to eliminating school resource officers and the funding for school resource officers. We're opposed to abolishing qualified immunity. We're also opposed to establishing citizen review boards for elected sheriffs by local governing bodies. Elected sheriffs have the ultimate citizen's review. There's an election for the sheriff of that community. This final point is in accordance with the Senate position of these two important issues. These issues of qualified immunity and citizen's review board are of major concern, and the Virginia Sheriff's Association looks forward to continuing the dialogue with members of both the House and the Senate. Nothing offends sheriffs more than having bad cops. We feel fortunate that Virginia has thus far been spared from similar egregious incidents that we've witnessed in other states. Further, there's nothing more devastating than the impact on public safety than passing House Bill 5013 in its current form. We also want to make sure that we remind the Senate and the Senate leadership and commend them for referring this important issue for further study. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Howard Hall, Howard-Hall. I'm the Chief of Police in Roanoke County. I'm also the President of Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police, at least for a few more days. Thank you, Chief DeBoard, for next week. Last week, one of your colleagues in Roanoke asked me what I thought of the General Assembly special session. So here's what I told him. I said, clearly there's a significant group of members, particularly on the House side, that are anti-police and pro-criminal. These members, and perhaps others, are doing nothing more than pandering to radical activists for their own political gain. Unfortunately, these actions are likely to lead to increased danger, not just for our officers and deputies and troopers, but for our citizens. Efforts to undermine the ability of law enforcement to carry out our responsibilities, place undue burdens on local governments through unfunded mandates, reduce funding in some cases, and lessen accountability for criminals puts us all in danger and will result in less efficient police service. I think it's notable that in the numerous times that I've reviewed the list of bills that are being considered, I can't find one single piece of legislation that does anything for a victim. I think that's fairly sad. Let me talk about some specific examples as my colleagues have. There is a proposal to change the rules essentially around the use of deadly force, including a requirement to, quote, exhaust all other options before using deadly force, and to create a list of criteria that would have to be used to determine totality of the circumstances. In practice, this is an unrealistic expectation for an officer under the stress of a rapidly evolving situation making split-second decisions. Deadly force law is generally governed by the United States Supreme Court. And the key case on that is Graham versus Connor from 1989. And the key part of that case was that the force used, deadly force or otherwise, must be objectively reasonable, based on the totality of the circumstances known to the officer at the time the force is used. In that opinion, the court specifically noted that 20/20 hindsight was not the appropriate way to judge this type of incident. If this proposal is enacted, our citizens would actually have more authority to use deadly force to defend themselves than our law enforcement officers would have to defend themselves and others. This simply defies logic. Legislation like this endangers our officers, who are expected to enter dangerous situations, as well as our citizens, who we hope to move away from those situations. There was another bill that would remove FOIA exemptions for criminal investigative files. Our law enforcement agencies collect a tremendous amount of very sensitive information and personal information during the course of a criminal investigation. Under current law, these files are not required for release. This provides protection to victims and witnesses whose information released to the public, or particularly for those who might be involved in crime, could be dangerous. Of course, all of this information is available to those who need it. Our prosecutors, our courts, our judges, juries, whether that's criminal or civil, by the way. Exposing this type of information will actually discourage cooperation with law enforcement. Frankly, how many of you would want your personal information to be released to the public as a result of a criminal investigation that could be open to anybody? I don't think there are too many folks that are interested in that. It also could create a tremendous administrative burden, again, for local government having to root through and redact anything that might be excluded. This would make the work of law enforcement more difficult, therefore reducing the likelihood of bringing criminal investigations to successful conclusions. Mental health, an important issue for us, an important issue for our communities. There are several bills that would help to find better ways to deal with people in crisis and suffering from mental illness. We support expansion of CIT training, for example. We also support the appropriate development of what's known as co-response models, where police work with mental health professionals to help de-escalate situations and get people into appropriate resources to get their mental health needs addressed. Unfortunately, there are proposals out there, and including the one particularly known as the Marcus Alert, that would be counterproductive. Most of the calls that our law enforcement officers receive related to mental health involve some level of danger. We're getting called because people are suicidal, because people are acting out, because there's been some sort of violent act. The idea that social workers or other mental health professionals are going to respond without police is simply foolish. Additionally, the idea that an unarmed law enforcement officer is going to respond with mental health professionals is simply not going to happen. Finding better ways to handle mental health crisis is critical, but will require a collaborative approach between first responders and mental health professionals. And there are bills that have been proposed that would do just that and figure out what's the best way to do this, as opposed to bills that are essentially knee-jerk reactions from politicians. My colleague from the Sheriff's Association just mentioned citizen review boards. We strongly oppose these as a mandate. There simply isn't any evidence that they provide a positive outcome. As agency heads, whether we're a police chief or a sheriff or a superintendent or whatever the title, we are responsible for the conduct and discipline of our employees, just as any other head of, pick an organization, would be. As police chiefs, we are directly accountable to our city managers, county administrators, or executive authority in our agencies, and in fact can be removed from our positions at any time if our conduct or our work is not appropriate. We are also bound in most cases by local human resources procedures that govern how we do that work, so that fairness is provided to our employees as well as accountability. Numerous agencies around the country have experienced with citizen review for really many, many years. In some cases, it's been noted that these boards are actually more lenient than police chiefs and sheriffs, which doesn't seem to make any sense. It's also notable that several of the agencies that have had particularly bad incidents have used these models for many years. I think the most pertinent right now would be the Minneapolis Police Department, that has had citizen review for quite a period of time. This is another bill that would create an unfunded mandate for local government, as this type of board would need staff support, administration, and even legal counsel. Traffic enforcement. Traffic safety is an important part of public safety. Too many people are injured and killed on our roadways every year in Virginia and around the country. Safe vehicles are an important part of safe roads. There are proposals in the General Assembly that would make violations such as unsafe equipment, malfunctioning taillights, loud mufflers, and obstructed views as secondary, meaning we couldn't stop that violation unless another violation had been committed. Does anybody really think that it's appropriate or safe for a vehicle on I-95 to be traveling without taillights at 11 o'clock at night? Does anybody not think that a law enforcement officer should stop that vehicle and deal with that dangerous situation? It's just common sense. If the General Assembly really believes that safe vehicles aren't important, perhaps they should just rescind the laws and let everybody drive around with whatever they would like. Downgrading to a secondary fence makes no sense, and again impacts the safety of our citizens on our roadways. There are a litany of other bad bills that are out there, and we simply don't have all day to cover them. One that I think affects many is the issue of funding. There have certainly been some calls for reducing state aid to local law enforcement or funding for the state police, which I don't believe is supported by our communities and is certainly short-sighted. In fact, many of the ideas that we're discussing, either those that we oppose or support, will require more, not less, resources for the agencies that implement them. I would suggest to you that much of the radical agenda that's being proposed will do nothing to help the people affected by crime or the communities that the General Assembly suggests that they are trying to help. In fact, it will do just the opposite. As crime increases, minority communities are likely to be affected the most. As law enforcement resources are reduced and services suffer, it will likely be the same communities who often require more service and demand more service that feel the most impact. This is a disservice to our citizens and, frankly, a dishonest approach to improving the criminal justice system. Finally, I'd like you to think about the combined effect of all of this on the men and women who protect our communities every day, regardless of what uniform they're wearing. Not only aren't they being supported by our General Assembly, they are being attacked. If these proposals are successful, their jobs will be more dangerous and their livelihoods could be affected. I'll leave you with a question that I asked the governor in June, and I have asked many times since. Who right now would want to be a law enforcement officer in Virginia? The governor didn't have an answer. Nobody else I've asked, honestly, has had an answer. And frankly, I don't have an answer. That's scary. That does not bode well for our communities. We hope that our citizens will start to speak up and contact their elected officials to demand that their public safety be the priority and that these radical proposals be defeated. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is John Orenberger, O-H-R-N-B-E-R-G-E-R. I am president of the Fraternal Order of Police of Virginia. I've been in law enforcement for 39 years. I've not seen anything like this in my career. I agree, so does the Fraternal Order of Police, and what my colleagues have already stated. So I'll keep my conversation briefly. We, the Fraternal Order of Police, have members that include sheriffs, deputies, sheriffs themselves, police officers, police chiefs, detectives, state troopers, state agents, and Commonwealth attorneys. We are gravely concerned with the items that have been discussed and that what we oppose. The FOP is strongly opposed to the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officers Procedural Guarantee Act as it is proposed in Senate Bill 5036. With that, I will stand for any questions, and we're done. Thank you.
Shout them out.
Go ahead.
I have a question. So the Senate is very likely going to pass their very large police reform bill today. Many of you alluded to the fact that you feel the Senate has been more willing to work with law enforcement than the House. How are you feeling about this bill, and what specifically in it do you oppose, if anything?
Thank you for the question. I will say that since well before the special session started, several members of the Senate reached out to me, to the Sheriff's Association, to the Chiefs of Police Association, and there are portions of that bill where we actually suggested wording that they accepted verbatim. We had any number of meetings. I myself met with the authors of that bill probably 6 or 8 times. And we have found them to be sensible, receptive, and we can live with that particular bill. And you're speaking about Senator Locke's bill.
Right.
We can live with it. We are not unhappy with it, and many of the issues that we've talked about here today, they took into consideration, and they made appropriate amendments and added language, removed language that we felt made the bill reasonable, practical, and will in fact move our profession forward.
In regard to that bill as well, some of y'all talked about no-knock warrants, and that bill, I believe, includes the ban on serving them at night unless there's a judge or magistrate. My understanding was there was some attempt to accommodate concerns of law enforcement. Why didn't it go far enough, even though it's more watered down than the House version?
There are 2 concerns in that bill, significant concerns, that Chief DeBoard and I think, each spoke of one. One is the increased restrictions on deadly force, which, as I said before, would actually make or give citizens more authority to use deadly force than law enforcement. Second is the service of search warrants, particularly the part that would require their service to only be during the day unless approved by a judge. Those are significant problems that we do not think are acceptable.
Can you've been talking a lot about the fact that you've been saying who would want to be a police officer right now.
Right.
If some of these bills pass that you're speaking of today, I mean, what would you anticipate in terms of retirement or simply quitting the force or simply not applying to be an officer? What percentage of officers may you lose?
You know, it's hard, I think, to put a percentage on that. I can tell you that I know of police officers in my jurisdiction that are waiting to see what happens, to decide whether they want to continue this as a career. I can tell you that right now, before any of this has happened, we are having an incredibly difficult time getting applicants to our departments. So we expect that the effect of this, if they're passed and signed into law, would be very significant on the staffing of our agencies. And I think the state police have a similar problem.
As of last Friday, we had 312 trooper vacancies. That number increased by 16 from 2 weeks earlier. So it was 294, it went up to 312. We have an approximately another 300 sworn personnel who are eligible for retirement and who I know for a fact are contacting our personnel department asking what do I have to do to apply. Let me give you one example. I had a 32-year veteran of the state police in my office last week. He joined the state police when he was 22 years old. He's now 53 years old. He had planned on working until he was 62 years old, 9 years from now. He's a very highly specialized trained special investigator. He is retiring October 1st, 3 weeks from now. He said, I'm done, I'm not taking it anymore. Similarly, we're having as difficult of a time not only retaining, but recruiting people. Applications are down, and it's only going to escalate. And both bodies, the House and the Senate, I started talking about this last January when they were here in regular session. We were at about 250 vacancies then. We're up to 312 now. So it's a very, very serious problem.
So, so you were saying that the House has made very little attempt to sit at the table with any of you? Is there any specific members that you need to speak with? Or, I mean, is it too late now? Or?
We remain open to speak with anybody, and we would encourage that dialogue. We have had specific dialogue with certain ones, and many of us reach out to those delegates and those senators that work in our specific jurisdictions. That's where we spend the most amount of our time, and that's where we really should be spending our time. But we are open to speaking with certainly anybody, especially the patrons of the bills who want to listen and who truly want to get the bills right. I did want to add one thing about this attrition issue and the retirement issue and the recruitment issue. I won't repeat what they said, it's all true. But the other thing that's really dangerous for our profession right now is that we have cops and sheriffs and troopers that are working, but they're shutting down. They're shutting down on duty. And this is especially impactful in jurisdictions where political rhetoric are driving how things are being done in those jurisdictions. They're afraid to act. They're afraid of being called out. They're afraid of engaging with their communities and maybe it getting mistaken in the wrong way or being perceived wrong and being hung out to dry. We can't have our officers, our troopers, our deputies standing back and watching things go bad in their communities and not taking action. They need to be able to engage without fear. That is as big a problem now as I have ever seen it in 34 years. And with the passage of some of these bills, that will only increase.
Richmond has had quite an uptick in shootings lately. Could some of this be some of the reason officers standing down?
I have no empirical data to support that statement. I've noticed the exact same thing. Your guess is as good as mine. But going back to your original question about talking to delegates, in June and July, before the special session, I spent a considerable amount of time traveling around the state, meeting with senators and delegates, including all of the leadership. We were asked to provide points on how we felt about various issues. Now, this was before any legislation was filed. And I remember one specific comment from one delegate that I met with who said to me, I'm going to introduce 7 pieces of legislation in the special session. Would it be okay if I forwarded you those drafts in advance and have you review them? To this day, I never saw a single draft. We spoke with them. They treated us very nicely. But I think the message, at least from my perspective, was largely unheard and unheeded.
I have a few questions about something you guys didn't bring up. Oh, sorry, did you want to?
I didn't want to address that. I can't speak for different associations and their contacts with our legislators, but to your question with regard to House members, I think our efforts with House members have been very productive, been very constructive. We, of course, have sheriffs that serve in those communities, those same communities as those House members, and we appreciate everything as far as their listening and the work that we have been able to come to common ground on with the House members as well as the Senate. So I just wanted to make sure that we stated that. Thank you.
I have a couple questions about this push to ban the acquisition, use, purchase of military surplus. I saw, a story NPR had done a while back that showed a lot of departments did get some of these big war vehicles, other supplies way back. I understand there was some effort by the Obama administration to shut that down. Is this bill relevant? Does it really impact you guys at all? And if so, how?
So I can't speak for all the agencies. A large amount of that question really speaks to the issue of resources. So some jurisdictions, I live in Northern Virginia, I work in that world, the resources generally are plentiful compared to other parts of the state there. So oftentimes things are bought instead of acquired through military. But I've also been with departments that have acquired things like patrol rifles and shields. Not everything that comes from military surplus is a tank. But there's been an argument that the communities don't need tanks, and I honestly disagree with that to a point. Maybe they do it in a shared manner, maybe there's a regional effect, but there has to be the right equipment for the right response. When you think about an active shooter, the police department, sheriff's department, troopers, they have no safe way to approach those things without an armored vehicle. Literally no safe way. If you have downed kids in front of a school, there is no safe way to make that approach without an armored vehicle. It just can't happen. So although they should be restricted in how they may be used, and that's a reasonable look at that, how are law enforcement agencies using this equipment, they absolutely play a role in community safety when those things come up. We have made some progress in those bills, so specifically the House bill initially banned tear gas, banned all use of kinetic energy munitions, which are your foam batons and rubber bullets. And I pose the question, so if you take all of these less lethal options away and you have a riot, what are law enforcement officers supposed to do? We can either go away or we can shoot. You leave us with no option. So they did put them back in with some reasonable restrictions on how they were used. We made some great progress with parts of that bill. There are still some significant problems with that. When I asked them about if the city street is being destroyed, if the property is being destroyed, nope, can't use them in that situation because that's not loss of life. Well, I would beg to differ. When you have a riot and you have mass violence, it spurs very quickly onto people from buildings. So there are still some issues with that bill that we have concern with, but we have made some progress there to allow us the latitude to have the less lethal tools at our disposal to use when we need to.
You all briefly spoke about mental health, and a lot of citizens are concerned about the way law enforcement interact with folks who are suffering some sort of mental health issue. Does there need to be more training in how officers handle a situation like that? Because I know one of your colleagues had mentioned the Marcus alert just would not work.
And I'll let him speak to that for a minute, but I'm going to go back to the same bill with the military acquisition. When they were going to put a complete ban on those kinetic energy munitions, the foam batons and those things, I had to explain to them, we use these probably weekly around the Commonwealth. We have somebody in emotional crisis, maybe has a knife, we can't get close enough to use a taser, or maybe that jurisdiction doesn't have a taser. So we may use from a distance a foam baton to knock that out of their hand, or to incapacitate them so we can safely take them into custody. Not everything we do is about riots. So that's why, when they start banning things without any input from us, it's a lack of education. That's why it's important. So part of that mental health response is for us to continue to have those less lethal tools so that we can safely deal with people who are violent and in emotional crisis. And I can let Chief Hall talk about the Marcus alert.
Well, let me try to address both parts of your question. From a training perspective, there are bills out there that we support that would increase the availability and in some cases require the crisis intervention training program, which is a 40-hour training program, which right now is about the highest level that a law enforcement officer can get in that area, I guess, without going back to school and getting some sort of degree. That's used in some academies. It's used commonly around the state, but perhaps not to the extent that it could be. So we support the expansion of that training. That training includes blocks that help officers identify people that are suffering from a mental health problem or a crisis, as opposed to other things. It also helps teach techniques to de-escalate those situations. So we think that's really, really important. The problem with the Marcus alert bill, it is extremely specific. It requires a whole checklist of things, which in some cases probably aren't feasible. There are other bills that support what's known as a co-responder model. So a police officer with a mental health professional, clinician, social worker, whatever that might be, respond to situations together. The idea being that the police officer is there for the safety of the people that are at the scene and of course the clinician. And once that's accomplished, the clinician can take over to try to get the situation stabilized at that particular time and determine what's the best course of action beyond that to get the person the help they need. Many times that doesn't necessarily mean that the person needs to be taken for an emergency custody order or anything else. You know, there may be other options that mental health professionals can use. We support that concept, but it's got to be done appropriately. There are numerous models around the country. I came here 8 years ago from the Baltimore area. We had that in my former department. We felt like it worked very well. We felt like it helped us to avoid taking people into custody either for evaluation or for criminal matters when that mental health professional was available. Now, you know, I have to point out on both of these initiatives, resources are an issue. There has to be resources for the training to be provided. While some of the CIT training can involve instructors from law enforcement, a substantial amount of it requires mental health professionals. So the resource for that has to be there. It's doable. We do it in our academy. So we've figured it out, but it took some resources. And the co-responder model probably more so. You're going to have to fund mental health professionals and fund the law enforcement officers to implement that approach. But we think both of them would be valuable.
2 more questions. Time for 2 more.
I'm just wondering if anybody actually has, on the military surplus, any of these MRAP tanks that it looks like some use for flooding that's standing here.
We don't have an MRAP, we have an armored vehicle that we purchased.
Okay, so different, but I know that there's some back and forth going on about that in the session, so none of you guys actually have those.
I think the issue with the MRAP is it's an armored vehicle that's been made available through the 1033 program. It is a big, big vehicle based on whatever it was designed for in the Middle East or wherever it's been deployed. For a department that doesn't have the resources to obtain a smaller, perhaps less visible armored vehicle, it may be the only option they have. So probably none of us would want a vehicle that size. I want you to think about you maneuvering these things on neighborhood streets. It's not the most desirable option, but for some, it's probably the only thing that they can get. And for the safety of their officers, they're going to the MRAP because they don't have the resources to buy something that might be, a little bit more appropriate.
1 more question. Anybody else? All right. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.